So we are, of course, a little early for Thanksgiving, but maybe you're thinking ahead. I love this reading. I first heard a version of it from Sami Nosrat herself. She says essentially the same thing in the TV adaptation of her book, Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat. Her book and that TV adaptation, which I think is still available on Netflix, I haven't watched it in a while, are based loosely on her own work as a restaurant chef and her explorations of different food cultures, including her own Persian culture. So she proposes, and it's right there in the title, this simple but powerful framework for understanding how cooking, and therefore any prepared food, works. And from that simple framework, how a nearly endless amount of variety can arise. She says that salt, fat, acid, and heat are the four most important components, ingredients, one might say, that determine how food is transformed from raw ingredients into prepared dishes. So to expand upon the very simple example in the reading, we might make mashed potatoes. So we would boil our potatoes, that is using heat to break them down and soften them into a different form, along with cutting them and mashing them, of course. We would add salt because potatoes desperately need salt to heighten and enhance their flavor. Indeed, Nosrat makes quite a point of adding what most of us would consider to be just heaps of salt to any water she uses to boil just about anything. We would add some fat, probably in the form of butter or cream or milk or all of those things. Why? Well, fat is flavor and can also help the potatoes have that creamy, luscious texture we're going for. Acid, well, as she pointed out, mashed potatoes don't often have a ton of acid, but actually the butter and cream we added a minute ago does have, they are slightly acidic, so they give a little bit of that, and you can give some other examples. You could add sour cream, as she suggests, or other ways to do it. Or to give a better example, perhaps, let's switch potato styles for a second. Do you like ketchup with your French fries? Well, part of the reason you like it is because ketchup is very vinegary. It provides a nice contrast to the potatoes. In short, through the use of salt, fat, acid, and heat, we've transformed simple potatoes into something fantastic. Or to give a different cultural example, very briefly, consider perhaps a taco that you might get from a street vendor in Mexico City, or anywhere, really, these days. Using heat to make the tortilla and cook the meat and veggies, which are probably cooked in their own fat or perhaps in a lard or vegetable oil. And this time the heat isn't going to come from boiling, probably, but instead grilling or roasting. And there'll be salt added, to be sure. And for acid, this time we might use lime juice or any one of a number of salsas that have a relatively high acidic content. A completely different culture and cuisine, but still we can understand the cooking process through the same framework. Now, I don't think that salt, acid, fat, heat framework, and I think Nosrat would agree with me on this, it doesn't cover everything there is to know about food, right? There's also, for instance, physical transformations that we do to food. Those potatoes are not going to mash themselves. I have not yet met corn that grinds itself into masa and then forms tortillas by itself. And there are a million flavors, many of them wonderful, that are not very directly related to acid or salt or fat. At least not, yeah. But I love thinking about food in this way ever since I first heard her propose this. I like thinking about what makes a dish I enjoy work, about how it got from the ingredients it started with to what I'm enjoying. Because I love cooking, I love eating even more. I like trying something new. I love figuring out why something works or doesn't work, as the case may be. I love thinking about how I might replicate this or what I might do a little differently instead of it. So I could certainly stand here and talk to you just about food for 20 minutes. That would be no problem at all for me. But I do want to go a little bit beyond that in our sermon today, because I think food in this framework of Nosrat's is also a really interesting way to think about community. There are many ways to do it, And though I know there are some absolutely wrong ways to do both cooking and community, there is also a nearly infinite number of right ways. There are hundreds, thousands, again, maybe infinite ways to do them the right way, or a right way. We might think of the various communities of which we're already a part: our family, our group of friends, our church, or another social organization, our workplace or our school, our neighborhood, our city, state, our country, countless others we might name. Because all of those communities have some things in common. They connect a group of people through some shared characteristic or identity. Almost all of them, maybe all of them in some sense at least, have some sort of meeting or gathering, or at least way of communicating with one another amongst the group. All of those communities have shared norms of behavior, and many of them even have shared doctrines or beliefs, whether those are explicitly stated or implicitly known and understood. But oh, the variety, because that shared characteristic that draws a group together, well, it could be shared DNA, or shared citizenship, or just a great affinity for the music of Taylor Swift. And the meetings and gatherings may be very formal. Again, you need, I am given to understand, quite an expensive ticket to go see Taylor Swift in concert. Or they might be very informal, like the front yard conversations you have with neighbors as you walk your dog. The communication might be a website or a newsletter, or just the gossip grapevine. And the shared norms of behavior or belief, I don't even know if I even want to go down that road right now. That's a lot of things to get into if we're going to talk about the behavior of certain organizations of which we're a part, or their beliefs. But it did make me think that sometimes even a seemingly small difference can make all the difference. To go back to food for a moment, I read an article years ago by the food writer Fuchsia Dunlop, which is quite a name, Fuchsia Dunlop. She spent quite a bit of time in East Asia, particularly in China, and has been very attracted to some of what we might think of as stinky foods. Fermented bean curd and various pickled things and all sorts of pungent, powerful, interesting, but perhaps off-putting to many of us, foods and flavors. So her own tastes had already included a love, for instance, for the stinkier, more pungent cheeses that Europe and North America has to offer. And she thought at some point in China, she noticed that cheese as a whole is not common in a number of East Asian cuisines. In fact, sometimes it's not used at all. But she thought, I've been talking to all these chefs and cooks about, again, fermented bean curd and such. Wouldn't their affection for these pungent, stinky foods extend to some of these cheeses too? And so she did an experiment. She brought Blue and Roquefort and Stilton and offered them up to her Asian friends. And the short answer is that they hated them. They were not at all into this. And she asked them why. She thought, this makes so much sense. Why wouldn't you be into this? Well, some of the flavors, yeah, they got that. But it turned out the texture was all wrong. The cheeses are too greasy. They stay on the tongue and the mouth for far too long. They have an unpleasant aftertaste, in contrast to what they were used to, which has light flavors that tend to go away quickly. So stay with me, because I want to come back to that in a minute. And so I think that all of this, ideas about community and perhaps food too, is part of what led me to become a member of a church and ultimately to become a minister. I saw a community different from other communities that I had known in many respects and yet recognizable as well. And over time with this community, I realized I wanted to be a part of shaping and nurturing and supporting that community. maybe even starting new communities like it. But to go back to our cheese and fermented bean curd, what a community like this is, that can be a little tricky, because the difference between fermented bean curd and fermented milk curd may not be such a small difference in the end. And I say this particularly to Unitarian Universalists because I think we are a unique dish, friends. I was talking yesterday at the graveside service for Bill, and Diana had told me that really in his life he was never much for religion. And I thought, that's perfect. That describes a lot of our best members here. Now, I very much think that we're doing religion, don't get me wrong, but I understand what someone might mean when they say that that's not for them. And I understand why they might say that's not for them and then be here every Sunday still. There's a lot tied up in that word. Some of those things are still very important here in our community, in my opinion at least, even in this weird church of which we are a part. But I very much get the impulse to distance oneself from a lot of those trappings, those ideas, those traditions of religion. But I was thinking about Unitarian Universalism and what kind of cuisine we might be. And I learned not very long ago about this thing called a chaos menu. If you've watched the show The Bear, they talk about this a little bit. The Bear is about a dysfunctional but brilliant chef who comes from a dysfunctional but fascinating family, who works in a dysfunctional but maybe fantastic restaurant that he created out of the shell of the family restaurant his brother left him when that brother died. There are sermons aplenty we could unpack from the show, and I may do that at some point. I also know the show is not going to be everyone's cup of tea, so if you hate it, that's okay, that's fine. But one little thing really I learned from the show was the concept of the chaos menu. And the idea is that instead of having a theme based on a cultural cuisine, think a French restaurant or an Italian restaurant or a Korean restaurant or what have you, or based on some other thematic idea. You might specialize in seafood or in vegan food or a steakhouse. A chaos menu brings together diverse ingredients, techniques, and influences to each dish in a progression of dishes. And it often seems like things shouldn't work together, but because of the thought and skill of those who prepare it, it not only works, but at its best achieves new experiences and new heights of brilliance. Again, that's the idea. I imagine this fails a lot. And I wonder if, perhaps unintentionally, that's what we're doing in Unitarian Universalism. Not a chaos menu, but perhaps a chaos religion. One that draws from many influences and seeks to bring them together in some sort of harmony. Now, I don't know that I, and perhaps very many of us, are fantastic at doing this. I don't think of myself as some sort of gourmet theologian putting together bespoke dishes of religious experience. Most of the time, I feel like I'm muddling through just trying to make sense of things. The equivalent, perhaps, of making sure there's some dinner to be served for the family each night, which is something I'm proud to say that we nearly always accomplish at my house. And when we don't accomplish it, well, you can get takeout, right? So, friends, I hope you enjoy whatever dish you're having tonight. And if not, well, there's always next time or pizza delivery. Because we're making a meal and a community, and it's not always perfect. It won't always be to your individual taste. And once in a while, it might just be plain bad. But we'll cook again tomorrow, and we'll try to get it right. May it be so.